So my talk today is on mistletoe and diversity and biogeography, and I wanted to focus on the dwarf mistletoes in the Idaho landscape. As Barbara said, I'm probably a little more familiar with some of the other mistletoes, have done more work on phorandendron more locally, but on the Laurentheaceae in the Southern Hemisphere. But have worked a little bit on Arceuthobium, which you'll see. So tonight I'm going to give you an introduction and then talk a little bit about overall the diversity of mistletoes, and then biogeography, and then we'll kind of switch to Idaho and talk about the species in Idaho, where they're found, and then a little bit on mistletoes in the environment, which has really been quite an interest of mine. So what are mistletoes? They are parasitic flowering plants, and they live on and invade a host plant. So the host really supports them, but also provides other water and nutrients because the parasite penetrates the bark. And mistletoes are photosynthetic, and so they don't rely on their host for carbon, but they do for their water and nutrients. And this is, I think, Psittacanthus here, which all of the flowering part is the mistletoe. So here is kind of the historical way people have looked at mistletoes. Mistletoe, rather than being an entity, is kind of a life mode, because they have to be branch parasites, live on the branch of trees, and they're found in 5 families. The Laurentheaceae, Viscaceae, Amphioroginaceae, Santalaceae, and Mysodendraceae. And there have been changes over time in how these families have been viewed. We tend to use Nick Grant 2010 idea of mistletoes, which is really more like the historical than some of the new things, where mostly they've merged things into the Santalaceae. And if you look at the families themselves, they have some different trends. Like the Laurentheaceae is striking in the number of genera that it has. So it really has a lot of genera, and most of those genera are rather small. So when you compare the number of species to the number of genera, a lot of the genera are rather small. The Viscaceae, on the other hand, which I have marked in blue because that is where your local mistletoe, the Arceuthobium or dwarf mistletoe, is within the Viscaceae. So I've kind of marked that with blue, and you'll see that throughout the presentation. The Viscaceae has really a relatively small number of genera, but it has a lot of species. And then the others are smaller in the number of genera and smaller in the number of species. And here's a tree, because I deal quite a bit in trees, particularly with my iris work. And it's mistletoes in the Santalaceae, and this was from Durr and Nick Grant in 2008. And you can see that in blue again is the Viscum clade, which they recognize and we tend to recognize as the Viscaceae. And then you have the Amphiorogine clade, which is the Amphioroginaceae. And then you have the Santalaceae, and only some of them are mistletoes. So those are in blue. And then the rest of the Santalaceae here are not mistletoes, but you come down to the outgroups in their study, the Mysodendraceae and the Laurentheaceae, and they are mistletoes. So what you see is that the mistletoe habit of plants growing on the branches of hosts, usually trees, has evolved multiple times. And here's some of the diversity that you see in the mistletoe. So we have Phoradendron, again outlined in blue because it's in the Viscaceae and so related to your dwarf mistletoe. And I put in 2 Lauranthecae because there are Lauranthecae that have very large flowers, as you can see in this Amiema, and then Lauranthecae that have rather small flowers, as you can see in Tharusa. So it's quite a diverse group in terms of flower morphology. And then we have the Dendromysera representing the Amphioroginaceae, and Antidaphne for the Santalaceae, and Mesodendrum for the Mesodendraceae. And each of these last 3 also have small flowers. So overall, you find in the mistletoes that you have small flowers. Now, this species of Mesodendrum is particularly attractive, I think, but those are filaments of the staminoids. So that is part of the flower, but the flower itself is overall rather small, except for these long filaments from staminoids. So you can see that there is a lot of flower diversity in the mistletoes, and particularly in some of the mistletoes, the Lauranthecae. And the other thing that I've dealt quite a bit with, as Barbara mentioned, are haustoria. And the haustoria is where the mistletoe connects to the host branch. And in the mistletoes, we have recognized 4 basic types, my husband and I. 4 basic types of haustoria: wood roses, clasping unions, epicortical roots, and bark strands. And you can see both drawings of these, and then you can see some living examples of these. And in the bottom right are bark strands, and that is the type of haustorium that is found in the Viscaceae. So it is the one that is found in the dwarf mistletoes or your Arceuthobium. And it's also the most common type. If you look at all mistletoes, some families are, it's not very common, but if you look at all mistletoes, the bark strands are the most common type of haustorium. So if you look at this, I'll just point it out. Here you have the mistletoe growing underneath the bark of the host plant. So here's the host, and here's the mistletoe that's growing within it. And here you can see, this is a small Phoradendron. You can see this enlargement here, where in fact the mistletoe is growing under the bark of the host. And here's the biogeography of the mistletoes. So you have the Amphioroginaceae and the 3 genera that are considered mistletoes. They all occur in Southeast Asia. This is Australia to get you oriented, right here and then right here. So they all occur in Southeast Asia and then into Australia for dendrotrophy. And the Viscaceae, which is where, again, the dwarf mistletoes are, it's quite widely distributed. And the interesting thing with the Viscaceae is it gets into the northern hemisphere, because most of the mistletoes are really southern hemisphere species. And then we have the Lauranthecae, which is mostly in the southern hemisphere, and the Mesodendraceae and Santalaceae. Again, in the Santalaceae, there are only 3 genera that are mistletoes, and they occur in the Americas, as does Mesodendraceae. So here are the dwarf mistletoes, and I wanted to point out, what do they look like? They really don't have the kind of diversity that we see if we look across mistletoes. They have reduced leaves, and this right here, I'm thinking that you're seeing my pointer, I hope. This right here is the mature leaf. This is as large as it gets. So it's really just a very small scale leaf. And you can see these on the actual plant here. These are the leaves right here. And then you have inflorescences developing. So the dwarf mistletoe, Arceuthobium, that it comes out of the branch and kind of forms this fruiting body or inflorescence with really very little stem leaves associated with it. But yet these are great leaves. Here's a stomata, so it is a typical leaf. And here's a leaf bud of, so this would be a young bud like any plant. Now we're in winter and pretty soon buds will be bursting, and as they open, you will have leaves within those buds. And here, in fact, you have a very young leaf bud, leaf bud. And here are all of these leaves that are present within the leaf bud, but they just don't develop very far. So your mature leaf is really not very large, but they start out looking like great leaves. And then the flower of the dwarf mistletoe is really also reduced. So here is a male flower, and you can see it. It has 3 parts or 3 stamens anyway, and it has these 3 stamens here on this very small plant. They have separate female and male flowers, and they're all really quite small. I have, instead of a picture, I have a section through a female flower. So you see the embryo developing here. You see the stigma, what is left of it, and you see the sepals here and the petals. So it is a typical flower, but just very much reduced. And here we're looking at the bark strands. So this is what all of the dwarf mistletoe haustoria look like. They have these bark strands. You can see here the dwarf mistletoe coming out of the plant, right out of the host branch. And you can also see this swelling. So see here how it's quite a bit, the host branch is quite a bit smaller, and then goes into this area of swelling, and we can't really see the other side. But when you leave that area of infection, the host branch will become smaller again. And here is a section through the haustoria. And what you can see is this area right here corresponds to this area. This is the bark strand. It grows along under the host, and I think we can kind of see that right here. Do you see this area that looks like it has something kind of a ridge? That's probably one of the bark strands growing under it, and that would be this part growing under the bark of the host. And then every once in a while, if it's going to be good at taking water, every once in a while it has to make contact with the xylem or the water carrying cells within the host branch. And so they call these sinkers, and they're growing down from this cortical strand that's growing along parallel to the host branch. It's growing down and is connecting here with cells that are moving water through the host. So that is kind of to give you an overview of what the dwarf mistletoe looks like. And now I want to kind of show you where it's found in Idaho and introduce you to some of the players. So you can see that it's pretty widespread around Idaho. And I took this from the Consortium of Pacific Northwest Herbaria website. And each of these represents collections in the herbaria that are part of this consortium, which includes, of course, the herbaria in Idaho. And this is the first species. I just happen to have them in alphabetical order. And the dwarf mistletoes, they tend to be, most of them are, or a lot of them are really named after their main host. So this dwarf mistletoe is called the lodgepole pine dwarf mistletoe. It's Arceuthobium americana. And of course, its main host is lodgepole pine. And the infection is either systemic or local. So I'm going to go back to kind of show you what I mean by that. So if you look at this infection here, it is in an older part of the branch. And so we could think of this as probably a local infection, but a few of the species, instead of growing down towards the main stem, so instead of kind of growing down towards where you would expect more water to come from. So if it's on a tertiary branch, it would grow towards a secondary branch. If it's on a secondary branch, it would grow towards the trunk. If it's on the trunk, it stays on the trunk. So you have these cortical strands that tend to grow towards a source of water, the main source of water. But you also can have systemic infections. And in those infections, the actual cortical strand of the mistletoe becomes embedded in the shoot apex of the branch. And so then as the branch develops and grows, the mistletoe also develops and grows. So it grows right along with the host tree. And those types of infections can really be more damaging, I would say, than more local infections. And they only occur in a few species. And one of those species is the lodgepole pine dwarf mistletoe. And it is also an interesting mistletoe because it was collected by Douglas in 1826. So there were two mistletoes collected by Douglas in 1886, and this is one of them. And this is not the first dwarf mistletoe that was collected. The first dwarf mistletoe that was collected and named was actually collected in around Veracruz, Mexico, and that was by von Humboldt when he was doing his studies down there. And that was in 1804, around 1804. And it was described by a botanist at the time who was describing a lot of species from Humboldt's trips, Wildenau, and he described it. He described this species, and it's Arceuthobium vaginatum is the first one that was described. But Douglas's collections are some of the first collections known. So this is Western dwarf mistletoe, and it is the other species that was collected by Douglas, and it is found on ponderosa pine. It is common throughout the Western USA, and so that's why I think it has his name, Western dwarf mistletoe, because it occurs throughout the West, and it's Arceuthobium campylopodium. And in Idaho, it occurs in Blaine County. That's where that little dot is. And its infection is local. You can see here an infection on the tree, and it's what they call a witch's broom, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Here is the Limburpine dwarf mistletoe. It's Arceuthobium cyanocarpum, and it is mostly on Limburpine or Pinus flexilis, and its infections are also local infections. And it is also not very common within Idaho, or at least this is the information I got from the Pacific Northwest Herbaria. And there are two collections in Butte County, and they're kind of interesting. When I was reading the collection sites, both of them are really associated with unusual soils. One of them is in Chalice National Forest, and it was associated with limestone. The other one is in Craters of the Moon. I think it's not a national monument. Maybe it's a national park. I'm not certain. But it was interesting that both of these collections in Idaho are associated with what I would consider kind of unusual soil or ecologies. And here's the Douglas fir dwarf mistletoe, Arceuthobium douglasii, and it occurs on Doug fir or Pseudosugia. And its infection is also systemic or local. And you lots of times see these really large brooms that you have here. And lots of times it can be towards the base of the tree. It tends to be more in Western Idaho, so it's not quite as widespread as some of the taxa. Let's see. And here is I think it's the last mistletoe that occurs in, maybe I better make sure that, I think it's the last mistletoe that I have that occurs in Idaho. It's Arceuthobium larissus, and it's on Western Larch, and it is also, the infection is rather local. And you can see here, this is kind of interesting. It has these dark blue berries. I hope you can kind of see those. A lot of the berries in Arceuthobium tend to be kind of white or, white or creamish, but maybe towards greenish, but it has a very dark berry to it. So, and you can see again that it is in Western Idaho. So, some of the main points I wanted to talk about today is kind of in interactions of dwarf mistletoe in the landscape. And I think we all think of them as forest pests. And that has been, the idea behind that has changed just a little bit. There's been a little bit of modification there, because most people say forest pests, particularly in stressed forests. So what we have found is that they really can be very common in forests, but when you really start to become problematic is when the forest itself is stressed. And those stresses, we'll go through a little bit of that in a minute, but those stresses can come from various, reasons, whether it's human activity or climate change or pests or whatever has stressed out the forest. You can see mistletoe infections increasing and become problematic. But also, in the last couple of decades, they have been seen as keystone species. So I think the first place that the idea of a keystone species for mistletoes came out of Australia. David Watson, who has really been promoting this idea or has been studying this phenomenon, particularly is an Australian and has studied mistletoes there quite a bit. Actually, he studied birds and mistletoes quite a bit and has become quite interested in mistletoe ecology. So they're considered a keystone resource in forests and woodlands worldwide. And some of those papers are quite interesting. There's also been work done in the US, and there have been documentation of them as keystones in our western forests as well. So when you think of them as a forest pest, there are several reasons. And one is this proliferation of the host near the infection. And this is called a witch's broom. And you see witch's brooms resulting from quite a few different kinds of problems. From, fungi infections can cause witch's brooms. Insect infections can cause witch's brooms. It's just a reaction of the host to this invader or to this pest. And that happens with dwarf mistletoes. It doesn't really happen with other mistletoes so much, but it does with dwarf mistletoes. And another thing you see is a reduction in the host branch beyond the infection. And that's because the mistletoe is really pulling water from the host. It turns out that its transpiration rate is higher than the host. And so it's able to pull water from the host. And that, of course, then means less water moving beyond the area of infection. It can cause a water stress in hosts, particularly if water is in short supply in the environment. And probably most importantly, it provides opportunities for other forest pests. So when it invades the bark of the mistletoe, other pests, fungi, and other insect pests can then enter, are more easily able to infect and enter into the tree. So, and then also this production of brooms can cause kind of this big host proliferation with rather weak branches lots of times. So it just kind of can facilitate, I would say, other forest pests. And in monocultures or stress forests, they can have high infection rates. As I showed you before, a lot of these mistletoes kind of have a preferred host tree. Some are quite, that preference is quite strong, and others less so. But if you have a monoculture and you have the mistletoe that prefers that host tree, then you can have quite heavy infections because they can spread kind of rapidly through that monoculture. And the other thing that can happen is fires can be more common in heavily infected forests, and that's because you have more branch loss and things like that will build up in the understory. So that is some of the effects that you're seeing in some of your local forests from mistletoes. But there's an upside, and that's the keystone species side. And witches' brooms, it turns out, provide excellent nesting sites. Here we have spotted owl, and it was found to, of course, to nest in mistletoe, which caused quite a stir at one time. And when they were trying to list the spotted owl and trying to log, those were at odds with each other. The American red squirrel, which is on the decline, nests in witches' brooms. They've studied that particular thing, and they've found that more than 50%, I think, of the Douglas fir nest for the red squirrel in, I think, southeastern Oregon, were in fact in witches' broom. So that Doug fir mistletoe which is the one that you have, is very important for a red squirrel nest. And then the pine siskin, which that's just one of the other examples. It nests also in witches' brooms. And there are others, Cooper's hawks, gray owls, northern goshawks, and sharp-skinned hawks eat them or nest in them. So there are a lot of things that nest in these witches' brooms. And they also provide food resources. So we have a lot of birds and other animals that will eat mistletoe berries and in fact prefer mistletoe berries. So the evening grosbeak is one. It's also declining. The mountain bluebird is one. Both of these use the Arceuthobium Douglasii, the one that you have, the Douglas, the one on Doug fir, as major food sources. Lots of times you see cedar waxwings when you're out I've seen them myself when I've been out in Eastern Oregon, and they'll be eating mistletoe berries during the winter because it's a winter food for them. The mistletoe berries are are late to develop and then stay on the tree all through the winter. And in fact, new berries will develop. So it can be a very important food. We don't usually think of mistletoes as producing a lot of nectar. I really, I think more of the berry as a food source, but in fact, it does produce a lot of nectar. And there are some native and honeybees that particularly use this nectar. Again, because it's a winter food, it's available early in the spring when other sources of nectar might not be as available. So it can be an important source. There are a number of butterflies that use both the nectar of the mistletoe, but also quite a few of them lay their eggs on mistletoe leaves or under mistletoe leaves, and the larvae then will eat the mistletoe when they hatch out. So Johnson's, or the brown mistletoe hairstreak butterfly, is one that is thought to only, in fact, use mistletoe for its larvae. So it can be quite important as a food resource. And the berries are very rich in protein, and then the nectar is very high in sugars. And another way that mistletoe adds to the environment, or another two ways, is really through soil nutrients. They've done quite a few studies on soil nutrients under trees with mistletoes and without mistletoes, and they found that the availability of phosphorus and nitrogen in particular, and some other micronutrients as well, is much increased under trees that have mistletoes present. And you can see here they're showing kind of this parasitized tree, and it's attracting birds, and the seed is dispersed then to other trees or to areas on the same tree. So it can be very important. And it also, because limbs can be lost, and plants can be lost, light availability increases also. So you have a much more open environment where you have mistletoes present. And here, in fact, it's showing you how that can happen where you have dead trees. And you might think of dead trees as always really bad, but in fact, they provide a lot of nesting sites for cavity nesting species. And we have a lot of those in the Western US. And the other thing, one thing that I've been working on quite a bit, and this work is in Australia, is, not in the Pacific Northwest, is, are the mistletoes also vulnerable um, to their environment? In other words, is it just the host trees that are affected, or do we also find that different kinds of mistletoes can do better in different environments? And in fact, we have quite a little bit of evidence that is just now being analyzed, showing that mistletoes, besides occurring where their host trees occur, they're also influenced by the environment. And in fact, if you look, this is looking at bark strands, clasping unions, the epicortical roots, and wood roses. And of course, the mistletoes um, that we're talking about tonight are ones with bark strands. And you can see that the mistletoes with bark strands have a fairly large range in terms of their annual temperature. So they can survive quite a large range in annual temperature. They do quite a bit better than the other mistletoes in that way. Here's their peak here. But in annual precipitation, they can be found where they're fairly dry precipitation. So they do seem to do well in those dry areas, but not necessarily restricted to a warm climate. They can be in warm or cold climates. And we really see that by the fact that most mistletoes, the majority of mistletoes, have bark strands, and they're found around the world. So it's not that surprising. But another important thing to think about in terms of mistletoes and the environment is that they're not newcomers. Clyde and I, my husband and I, were involved with a colleague on describing some new species that were found in amber. And this is Baltic amber from the Eocene. So 34 to 48 million years ago, in fact, mistletoes were present in the forest. And she got some very nice images from the Baltic amber. And you might see this and say, oh, well, that looks very much like our current mistletoe, and it does. But the interesting thing is, if you look down here, they have these small leaves. So at least the ones that she has found in Baltic amber, they have leaves. So they're rather reduced, but it does look as though Arceuthobium in the past, had leaves, and those leaves have become further reduced through time to where now they really are just these very small reduced leaves, that are just really the leaf bases plus a little bit. And this study also lends support to the fact that actually dwarf mistletoes, although they don't occur in Asia or Europe at this time, well, they do occur in Asia, but they're not very common. There are only a few species outside of the New World. I think there are 5 species outside the New World, and they're pretty restricted. That one time they were pretty probably common there, and that it was in fact a secondary spread into North America for Arceuthobium or dwarf mistletoe. So I'm going to go through, I think I have time. Oh, I'm doing great on time. Going to go through some conclusions to try and tie some of this together. Mistletoes are widespread in forests across the southern hemisphere, but they do extend into northern areas. And especially we see that in the Americas, where dwarf mistletoes are common. There are 4 basic types of Haustoria, with bark strands most common and the only type that we see in dwarf mistletoes. The floral and leaf diversity are very high in mistletoes in general, but if you look at dwarf mistletoes, they have reduced flowers and reduced leaves. Whoops, it says flowers and flowers, but they have reduced flowers and reduced leaves. And dwarf mistletoes can degrade stress forests, but they're also keystone species important for landscape diversity. And then mistletoes and terrestrial hosts have coexisted and evolved together during the development of modern forests. And when they have done a number of studies where they have removed mistletoes from the environment, and studies where they have developed plots both in mistletoe-rich and plots where there are no mistletoes present. And in all of those cases, they find that mistletoes add significant diversity to the environment. So there have been no studies so far that have shown that mistletoes decrease diversity. You have an increase of diversity both in animal species, but also in plant species within environments that have mistletoes. And they just, people kind of think of it as adding kind of this structural richness to the environment that just allows more species to be present. So some closing thoughts that I have is, what are we to do? Because mistletoes are forest pests, and yet mistletoes are keystone species. And I'm certainly not an expert on this part, but I have thought about it quite a bit. And I think we really have to encourage a development of forest tree diversity because of the way mistletoe, the dwarf mistletoe in particular, so I'm kind of thinking of your region, because of the way that mistletoes will tend to have preferences in hosts. The more diverse your forest is, the less often they're going to become really very dominant within the forest. They're really going to be only found on those species that are their preferences. And I think also encourage development of a diverse age class in forests. We tend to find mistletoes, particularly in middle-aged trees, probably. Of course, they are found in older trees, but I think if you have a diverse age class, then you have a bigger diversity for other species, and you're less apt to have the forest as impacted by mistletoes. And I think we have to slow down and ameliorate climate change effects, because if we have a drier forest and mistletoe is out transpiring its host, you're going to have drought stresses. And also, I think we don't think about this, but we really should be paying attention to hydrology in forest environments, because any kind of work we do in the forest will change the hydrological patterns, and these can have negative effects upon the host trees, and mistletoes can just contribute to that. And I think we have to continue to work towards better fire regimes or other load reduction methodologies, because it's been well known that through fire suppression, we have now forests that have a lot of what they call fuel loads within them. And the studies that they've done on mistletoes, a lot of when you say there's recycling and nutrients, they're not really talking about adding so much to loads as the mistletoes are, are adding their own leaf, their own leaves and their own um, nutrient cycling to the forest. So I don't think it's really that they're increasing load. That is not what I've seen in the literature. And we have to consider the whole forest health. So there we think about species diversity, edge effects, and forest pests together. And I think continue to educate the public on the ethical usage of fragile forest environments, because especially now, I think a lot of people, fortunately, are getting out and about and using our forests a little bit more in our wildlands. But all of that usage can impact our forests. So people really have to be very careful to stay on trails, to not impact the forests, because all of that can contribute to this degradation that we see within forests. So with that, I want to thank you for attending. I want to thank my collaborator, Clyde Calvin, who should have probably given this seminar, but has kind of quit giving seminars and encouraged me to do it. I also really wanted to thank Frank Hawksworth, who's no longer with us, for all of the work that he did on Arceuthobium. He's really the person who understood the systematics and the species diversity within Arceuthobium. And Delbert Wiens, who has also worked a lot with Frank and knows a great deal about mistletoes. So I want to thank them. And the University of California, that very nicely has accepted our collections and has accepted the mistletoe collections of several prominent people, including the Hawksworth collection, the U.S. Hawksworth collection, and the collection of Joe Pite. And then the collections, CSBR at NSF, that has funded the bringing together of these collections and getting them housed and in an appropriate way to where they can be used for further research. So thank you. And I have lots of times, I think, for questions. So.